I'm Sandy Goldberg from Antenna Audio. Welcome to the podcast series from Emory University's Carlos Museum. This time, we're going to talk about monsters. Well, ancient Greek monsters, to be precise, and they've got some doozies. Joining the conversation today are Louise Pratt from Emory's Classics Department, Bonna Westcoat from the Art History Department, and Marshall Duke, Professor of Psychology, and some little monsters.
I like that green guy with the one-eye Cyclops. Most of them have, claws and razor-sharp teeth. Most monsters are kind of really scary.
What started us off is one ancient Greek vessel in the Carlos Museum. It's decorated with a painting of a Cyclops, a giant one-eyed creature.
One very famous Cyclops was Polyphemus. What was his name?
The most famous Cyclops, named Polyphemus. He stars in the famous action sequence in Homer's Odyssey. If you can see images on your computer or your MP3 player, have a look while I summarize the story. During his travels, the hero Odysseus and his men go looking for food, and they wander into the giant Cyclops cave. When Polyphemus returns home with the flock of sheep he's been out grazing, he's none too happy with the intruders. Polyphemus captures the men by moving a huge boulder over the cave's opening, trapping them all inside. The clever Odysseus offers strong wine to the giant, making him fall asleep. Then, as the Cyclops sleeps, Odysseus and his men sharpen a huge piece of wood and drive it through his one eye, blinding him. The only problem was that the men were still stuck in the cave. But they knew that Polyphemus had to move the boulder in the morning in order to let his prized sheep back out to graze. As each animal leaves the cave, Polyphemus feels its woolly back. But Odysseus and his men have tied themselves underneath the sheep to their underbellies, and one by one they make their escape. Bonna Westcoat starts off our conversation.
We should perhaps add one detail in about the story, which is, on the whole, Greeks did not have their monsters eat people. I mean, one of the primal fears of humans is to be eaten. And most of the time, the Greek monsters don't. But the Cyclops is an exception. And one of the things he was doing to Odysseus' crew was gobbling them up, entrails, bones, and all, we're told. And that is another aspect of his monstrosity that an ancient Greek looking at this vase would remember.
If you were an ancient Greek, how would you understand the concept of monster?
There's size, first of all. I mean, Polyphemus is very large, but then there's something very unexpected, like a single eye. Or, on the alternatively, many eyes, as Argus has 100 eyes. Or many heads. Then you have hybrids of different animals put together. There's the chimera, the goat, lion, and snake. And then there's human-animal hybrids as well.
They're actually extensions of the natural world. They're things that are found in the natural world, either but miscombined or exaggerated.
Yeah, I think it's about understanding yourself a lot, in what ways you're different from animals, and then in what ways you also can be similar to animals. The Centaur has these tendencies that are very human in certain ways, and so does the satyr. It's a sexual energy, but often exaggerated.
It's not uncommon to define yourself by holding yourself up against someone who's different. When we travel, for example, in another country, we often learn more about our own country than we do about the one we visited. And so I think that many times these monsters represent a contrast to who we are.
So when Homer was writing the Odyssey, do you think he was inventing these monsters, or do you think he was to use a term that doesn't really belong with Homer, but was it the zeitgeist to express the worldview in terms of monsters?
Well, I think a lot of it is the zeitgeist. And in fact, we know that Homer probably wasn't actually writing it. He was retelling these stories for his own time. So these are often very, very old folk tales, but he's retold them in a more polished and practiced way. So.
But, I think everybody needs monsters.
Yeah, they express our fears, but they also express our human potential, because the story of Odysseus conquering the Polyphemus is both about the fear of what's large and going to eat you alive, but it's also about the potential for your intelligence to overcome that fear.
You don't have a hero unless you have a monster.
So in the Greek stories, is it mostly intelligence then that makes the hero defeat the monster, or do they just do it by brute force sometimes as well?
I think in this story, it seems to be intelligence, but also patience and well-placed violence, actually.
Yeah, there is a violent element that, and Homer really dwells on it too, because the eye crackles when the thing goes in the
and it's
eye
contained.
Into it.
It's contained. It's targeted and limited.
Strategic.
Yeah,
it's strategic.
Well, and then they have to wait all night, and then he has to cling to the ram all night, which is definitely part of what you're talking about, the patience and endurance of Odysseus.
Endurance.
Yeah, and don't forget the woman has to have incredible patience in that story as well, because Penelope and clever and cunning, because the story about her. So she's dealing with more human figures than monsters, but the same values are there. And they're not just military values.
They were a lot like centaurs. I mean, they were just sucking her dry of all of her stores and acting in incredibly ungracious and inhospitable ways.
What do you mean by that? What did centaurs usually do? They weren't very good house guests?
No, they were definitely not good house guests. They are an interesting creature, upper half man, lower half horse, beautiful in many ways, but without any sense of control. So, and the two things they were most vulnerable to were wine and women, and they abused both and served as a real moral exemplar in a lot of ways to Greeks, what humans in their worst could actually do.
Yeah, and their most famous story about them is they're crashing a wedding and actually getting drunk at the wedding and causing a violent war and carrying off
the women and the boys.
So, Marshall, as the psychologist, what would you say about that the Greeks were inventing these sorts of creatures that would just act in such inappropriate ways?
We haven't touched on the definition of the word or the source of the word monster. It derives from the word for warning. There are some parts to us, not only internally, but to our world, that are scary and that we have to be aware of. I think Arlo Guthrie was the one who said you can't have any light without a little dark to put it in. One of the only psychologists who's really dealt directly with the notion of the monster would be Jung, who spoke of the shadow, the dark side, very much as you would see in Star Wars, the dark side. The idea that within each one of us there are many parts, some of which are personal and some of which are collective. So the idea is, from the monster's point of view, that this is a representation of something not that's outside of us, but something that's inside of us.
So far we focused on male monsters, but of course the Greeks had some pretty great female monsters too. Were they, as a group, different in any generalized way?
The women monsters seem not to be about exploring women's interiors so much, but about male fears of women, because they're always these beautiful and alluring creatures compounded with these awful, terrible, destructive monsters. I mean, not always, but it's very frequently. The sirens are an example of this, that they lure men to them and then destroy them. Another example is the echidna, who's this beautiful nymph from the waist up, but then her bottom half is this terrible serpent and she eats human flesh. And that seems to be not about women themselves or women exploring their interior, but about men thinking about what's scary about women.
In many ways, men's weaknesses.
Yeah.
What about, the Medusa head is something a lot of people know with all the snakes. Was she always seen like that as just so horrible that